Welcome to Jewish Mysticism Lessons in Tanya, chapter 39. The second lesson of our series titled The Power of Kavanah, or the power of intent, or the power of enthusiasm. In other words, the power of the motivation behind the mitzvah. And this is the second week we'll be discussing that topic. And in the practical Tanya by Rabbi Chaim Miller, we are on page 450. And of course, you should have your handout for the power of Kavanah part 2. Everybody have one?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Good.
And the discussion in today's lesson, today's chapter, the Alter Rebbe really starts to get very Kabbalistic on us, which happens on occasion. And one of the major things we're going to discuss today is sort of the spiritual realms or the spiritual statuses that we reach when we do a mitzvah. Okay. But the Alter Rebbe opens the conversation, and then of course the main purpose of our conversation is going to be to understand, right? Meaning, on a practical note, I'm not sure how much it really affects our mitzvah and how powerful our mitzvah is, whether it ascends to a certain realm or to another realm, right? Or meaning, if I tell you that when you give tzedakah, it goes up on this spiritual level, on that spiritual level, etc. It's nice information, but it doesn't, right? It doesn't affect my tzedakah to any large degree. So it's not such a practical conversation. The purpose of today's conversation will be that Alter Rebbe will discuss where our soul goes and where our life and our and what sort of spiritual energy we're receiving in our lives when we do each mitzvah, because the purpose of this conversation will be the level of our kavanah, the level of our intent, the motivation behind the mitzvah, the drive behind the mitzvah is strongly going to affect how high it's going to get.
But yet we're limited.
Right?
What did you say?
Why does that affect this conversation? Correct, we are limited.
We cannot go to Atzilut, let's say.
We're going to get there. As it turns out, we will be able to get to Atzilut.
Good.
You like it?
Yeah.
It's a great vacation spot.
I don't know.
So the Alter Rebbe opens today's conversation by reviewing the last 2 points we mentioned in chapter 38. At the end of chapter 38, for those of you that were with us last week, will remember that we discussed that there are two types of kavanah, right? So kavanah, to summarize, loosely translated, is intent or motivation, and what it refers to is the power that we put into our mitzvah, right? So when I do a mitzvah, do I just do it, or do I infuse it with meaning? Do I infuse it with emotion, etc., right? Do I just daven to Hashem and tell of the greatness of Hashem, or do I work myself up into this burning desire to connect to Hashem? Hashem is so great, and I love Hashem so much, and that's why I praise Hashem, right? That's the difference between kavanah or no kavanah. And at the end of chapter 38, the Alter Rebbe introduced that there are two ways that we can do that sort of kavanah. They correspond to two levels of status in this physical world, but let's leave that as it may. That was for last week. In this week, the Alter Rebbe just summarizes those two levels. What are those two levels? So any mitzvah we do is hopefully fueled by an emotion, but there are two different ways that we can arouse that emotion, right? So, and you can choose any mitzvah, right? Shabbos, right? So there are, I guess, to summarize, there are 4 ways that I can do the mitzvah of Shabbos, right? I choose to rest on the 7th day, and to keep Shabbos, and not to do the 39 melachot, and to make kiddush, and whatever it is, to put on tefillin, any mitzvah I do, right? There are 4 ways that I can do it. Number 1, the lowest way, is it's motivated by something other than God, right? Shabbos is probably not a good example. Tefillin is not a good example. Maybe Torah study. I study Torah as an intellectual pursuit. There are many people that study Torah, and it's the furthest that they actually open up a Bible, or they open up a Talmud, or whatever it is, and they actually read the words and they understand it, but it's the furthest thing from studying Torah. Because when they open this up, they treat it as if it's some, intellectual pursuit. They treat it as if it's just more, another feather in my hat. It's just more to stroke my own ego. I want to be more of a professor. I want to be more of a scholar in the intellect, so therefore I study more. It has nothing to do with the great power of studying Torah, and we're connecting to divine intellect, like we discussed in chapter 5 and many times since. To them, studying Torah is purely about, engorging my own ego and stroking my own intellectual prowess and proving my power to the world, right? So this is a mitzvah that's not just not fueled by kavanah, by proper kavanah, but it's fueled by kavanah to the opposite, right? It's fueled by a desire to do the opposite of connected to Hashem. That's the lowest level. The next level is staticity. Is that a word? Right? It's static. Many of us, often, as Torah and mitzvot observing Jews, we commonly find ourselves in this category. Our mitzvot are by rote. I put on my tefillin. It's not fueled by anything negative. It's also not fueled by anything positive. I'm just doing it. No kavanah, zero kavanah. Last week we discussed what happens when there's no kavanah, right? We'll touch on it again today. And the top two levels are when it is fueled by some sort of emotion, by some sort of arousement, by some sort of enthusiasm. But they're on two different levels. Right? So level number 3, or let's call it level number 1, is when it's the natural emotion that every single one of us has inside of us. Right? We said that every single Jew inside every single Jew, we are gifted from above a love for God that lies dormant within us. It's natural, it's inherent to our creation, and all we need to do is fan that into a flame, and then we've got a love for God. It's not something I worked that hard on. Obviously, I'm conscious of it. Obviously, I get credit for being conscious of it and for allowing that to fuel my mitzvah, right? But it's not too difficult to get in tune with. If we're davening, and we get in tune with that inherent love that we have for God, then we do it. The next level, and the highest level of them all, is when the Torah and mitzvot that we do is fueled by a kavanah, is fueled by a power, by an emotion, by a motivator, which is consciously aroused. What do we mean? It's non-existent in us. It's not just that natural love that we each have for God. We start from scratch, and we build up a love for God. One of the things that's been extolled and that's been given virtue and value in the Tanya, probably the most of anything so far in our studies. When we actively choose to engage in meditation and thinking about Hashem and until it arouses an actual love for Hashem and something that we give birth to of our own conscious free will. Right? Consciously arousing a proper emotion for a mitzvah, which then fuels and motivates the mitzvah, and that brings us to do the mitzvah. Right? Working ourselves into such a spirit. Now the Talmud in Sanhedrin tells us that the service of tzaddikim is higher than the service of angels. When the Talmud says this, the Zohar explains that it's not just referring to, just some nice feel-good statement, like, oh, when you do a mitzvah, it's higher than the angels. No. Rather, it's actually literally talking about spiritual realms, literal differences that there are as to where the soul or the angel finds itself. Why is that? Because you see, before we begin, let me preface by introducing or reviewing the 4 spiritual realms, which I think we've touched upon many times throughout our Tanya learning, and many of you are familiar with. But the 4 spiritual realms are Asiya, Beriya, Yetzira. The opposite. Asiya, Yetzira, Beriya, and Atzilut. Right? Or in descending order, Atzilut, Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya. Very roughly, because now is not time to discuss all of them. What's that? So very superficially, because now is not time to discuss all of them. The word Atzilut means emanation. The word Atzilut, it refers to the spiritual realm which precedes any sort of creation of the world or any sort of diminishment or tzimtzum that there is before the world is created. In other words, Atzilut is the first world, so it's the first thing that's quote-unquote separate from Hashem, but yet the name Atzilut itself, which by the way comes from the same root as Etzlo v'samuch, which means next to God, it is nothing more than just a further iteration of God. It's sort of a specific iteration of God, let's call it, and that's it. As a matter of fact, the word for Atzilut given for the most part in English is emanation. Emanation is not creation, right? It's not a separate entity. It's just a further expression of godliness. Beriya, which is the next realm, is actually the Hebrew word for creation. That's because, not because there's any physical existence there, but the potential for physical existence exists there. Which means that the jump from Atzilut to Beriah is the biggest jump. Everybody with me here? Because you went from, because that's the most difficult thing to do. That's the most difficult thing, so to speak, that God did. He went from being just Him and just expression of Him to potential for existence like something outside of God. How's that, right? So even though there's no actual existence, but the potential, and the fact that happened meant there needed to be a huge tzimtzum in between, which we discussed before, never at length, and today is not the day either. That's Beriah. Yetzirah is not physical creation yet, but there are creations there. Yetzirah means, the best word for Yetzirah is usually formation. And what that means is and that there are spiritual creations there. There are spiritual forms and specific forms, and this is why the Talmud tells us, or the Zohar tells us, I think the Talmud says it as well, that where do the angels hang out? That's in Yetzirah, right? Are angels a physical existence, something outside of God? No, they're expressions of God's will, but they're specific expressions of God's will, and an angel can only do one thing, he can't do another thing. It's the beginning already of something, right? Like we are, distinct human beings from each other, distinct creations, one from the other. And finally comes the level of Asiyah, which is the world of action. In other words, that's where God actualized the world. The world actually came into actualization, right? How many times did I say the word actual there? In this world of action, even that is separated, by the way, into the spiritual world of action and the physical world of action, and we reside in this is the physical world of action, right? Finally, God figured it out. Physical human beings in a physical world, they're so full of themselves. Let them figure it out on their own, right?
So clarification. So in the top one down from God.
See, look, well,
Beriah.
there's lots of other levels above the four realms, but yeah, go ahead.
Not only, but it's potential.
No, the second one is potential for creation.
That one. Potential resides there.
Not potential for us, but
No.
the potential for creation.
And can you comment more on that? Potential. What is that?
Well, let's just put it much simpler. We don't have to use the word potential. Before something is created, there's a step before that, right? Meaning, I guess we could always do this, but on a certain level, let's just say it like this: there's non-creation. Not even an ability for anything to be created, because there's just God and He fills the entire void, and godliness and creating something that's going to be separate from God is a complete contradiction, right? And then there's creation. Something was actually created. In between, there's obviously at least one step, right? Which means the ability for something to be created, the potential, the thought, the prerequisite, that makes sense?
So would it be accurate to say when something is created, it moves out of potential and got actualized?
Correct.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Yep.
But the moment that the realm, or the fact that, let's look at it this way, even though it's a very physical human way of looking at it, right? Because for God nothing is hard, and for God nothing is an achievement, right? But if I was trying to achieve something, let's say I wanted to build a library. The first step is I have to have the idea to build a library, right? Then I have to have the money to be able to afford the library, right? Then I have to actually speak to someone, hire someone. There's like lots of steps like that, right? So at each step, I become closer. I've achieved another stage. I've become closer towards actually having a library. I guess in today's, like now in 2019, we could say a mikvah, right? So there was, I don't know, maybe when Rabbi Anoka moved down here, he never even thought that he should build a mikvah. But then at one point, he decided that he should build a mikvah, right? Or he even thought of the idea of building a mikvah. At that moment, that was probably the furthest step that the mikvah came from not being in existence to being in existence. Does that make sense? Even though now we've done construction, we've dug, and we've afforded stuff, and we've made fundraisers, and we've drawn blueprints and lots of things, but probably one of the biggest stages was when he said, we're having is already, there was a practical plan, I'm going to do this, that's a vision. Way before that, when the idea even of building a mikvah, it could even have been when Rabbi Anoka was a young child and had heard of a mikvah for the first time and thought maybe not even him thinking maybe one day I'll have a mikvah, but the ability for him to think that is by the idea of a mikvah being in his head. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess my point is that there's lots of different steps like that along the way, right? Essentially,
so are you calling all those steps potential, or
no. Essentially, each of these realms is another step along the way. At one point, the potential has to be born for the world to be created, right? And that is actually the biggest step. From non-potential to potential, in other words, from going from the world just being non-existent, in other words, it's just God. The ability for us to even contemplate an idea of there being a world is the biggest step. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So you can say that.
Let me ask you a question. You're always telling me. Oh, of course, man is the idea of God, but man is the actualization of the idea of God. But let me ask you a question. You always tell me God is so unlimited. God is so unlimited. God fills the entire void. There's nothing else besides for. There's nothing else besides for God. So the first step towards the world existing, the hardest thing almost to do for God to do, was to create the concept of a world being able to exist. Does that make sense? That's what I call potential. In other words, yes, for him to create a physical world was very hard, very difficult, very counterintuitive, very counternatural, etc. But the idea, even, that a world would exist, then it actually came into existence.
Outside of potential, but before the idea,
you could use whichever words you want. I mean, if we were talking about these nuanced concepts, I wouldn't let you use whichever words you want. But for now, for the superficial overview that we're giving of the four realms, yes, Berea is the okay. But for lack, by the way, I allowed this to get off topic because it is, these things are necessary to understand the four realms, but they're not necessary so much for today's conversation. For today's conversation, the main thing we have to understand is that there are four spiritual realms, and that these.
Before the 6 days creation, this happened already.
Actually, these things are not necessarily time limited. Does that make sense? These are not necessarily chronological. Right now, every moment the world is being recreated, and every moment this process is being followed. Does that make sense? I know it's a little mind-bending for us that are so time-oriented.
That first one.
Remember, these four realms that we're talking about, Catherine, are even before time was created. Right? In other words, time and space are a physical creation. Let's not go there. Okay? But for the purpose of our conversation, what we need to understand is that there are four spiritual realms. And when we say we connect to God, or we ascend to heaven, or our soul basks in the radiance of light, any sort of term like that, and godly energy, spiritual energy, anything like that we're connecting to, is going to have to be somewhere along that spectrum, right? Where the high end of the spectrum is God himself, as he is, without any worlds or potential for worlds or anything like that disturbing him, right? And then the lowest realm will be just here, physical creation of some sort. Now, the Talmud, I believe it's the Talmud that tells us that the angels, they hang out in the world of Yetzirah. The souls of tzaddikim are able to ascend to the world of Berea. Okay? So they go one level higher. Why is that? That is because the world of Yetzirah is purely an emotional world. And the angels serve God purely based on emotion. Now, we just finished extolling the virtues of emotion, of something that's done with emotion, right? We do a mitzvah and it's filled with emotion and it's driven by emotion, etc. Here we're being told that the angels are on a low level because it's driven by emotion. The reason that is because their mitzvot, or whatever you want to call it, right? They don't do mitzvah that we do mitzvah, but they certainly have missions of God in this world. There's no choice. And it's automatically done with emotion, which is why, by the way, the angels are referred to by animalistic names, because everything is driven by emotion. And there's zero intellect. What do we mean? The power of the kavanah that we put into a mitzvah is ideally that it's not just driven by emotion. Right? Kavanah, as we said, can be two things. On one level, it can be just emotion, raw emotion that powers something, but that's a very low level. That emotion can be a natural emotion that's found within ourselves. We didn't put that much work into it. When we use our freedom of choice to choose to think about godliness, to arouse within ourselves an emotion, and then our emotion is not purely emotion, but it's emotion born by intellect, In other words, it's intellect-driven emotion.
It's focused.
I don't know if it's focused. I don't know if the word is focused, so it's not true. It doesn't need to be focused. It can be open-ended. But it's mainly that there's an intellect. By intellect here, we don't mean smarts. We don't mean smarts. We mean there's active, conscious thought which is giving birth to an emotion. Right? There's consciousness which is giving birth to that emotion. It's not just, oh, let me think about Hashem, and I love Hashem, and da-da-da, and it's a nice love for Hashem. But rather, I take a moment to think about Hashem, to meditate on God's greatness. On many different levels. Think Kabbalah, think Chassidus, think philosophy, whatever it is. And you come to some sort of deep understanding of godliness, which then arouses a major emotion within us, right? We all know this. We all know that with another human being, it can start off as a very physical, attraction. I love this person. I don't really love that person. I love the way they look. I love the way, right? Then it can become, I love the way they make me feel, right? But hopefully, spouses can reach a very deep level of, I understand the other person, and the more I know about the other person, the more that evokes a love within me. Hopefully, you can reach such a strong level that the more someone thinks about something, the more they love them. Why is that? Why is there? I thought this is thoughts, this is intellect, this is emotion. No, because as we've discussed very often in Tanya, our intellect drives our emotion. And the ultimate kavanah that we can have for a mitzvah is when our intellect drives our emotion. Now, this is not a level that every Jew reaches every time he does a mitzvah. Certainly not. Tzaddikim consistently reach such a level. And therefore, their souls, we are told, rise, they ascend to the level of Bria. Why? Because Bria is the realm of intellect. In the words of the Zohar, Eima ilah mekanana beBria. That the Holy Mother, which refers to Bina, which is intellect, resides and hangs out in Bria, in this realm called Bria. Because that's where the souls go. If it's not just a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah, right? It's being carried out by a mitzvah, not just by a mitzvah, but by a mitzvah that's fueled by an emotion that's driven by intellect.
Do you mean...
Everybody on the same page as me here? Go ahead.
When you say the souls reach there, do you mean after they're passing the tzaddikim?
No. In that moment.
Their mitzvah,
in that
their
moment.
soul literally
By the way,
is there.
yeah, we are actually referring not to, right, out of the 5 levels of the soul, we're not referring to ruach or below. Right? Ruach, nefesh and ruach, right? Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida is the 5 levels of the soul, which we've discussed at different opportunities. So nefesh and ruach, they remain down here. Neshama, the highest level, goes up and does that. Why? Yeah, while the person is living down here.
Okay.
We're pretty awesome, huh?
Yeah, we are pretty awesome. I told you this is going to get a little Kabbalistic. Irit is loving it.
Yeah.
But I want to say something quick.
Yes.
Somebody can intellectually want to study, but by studying, it can become a love for God.
Okay. What you're referring to is a level, you're saying it can start off driven by an ulterior motive, and then eventually it becomes for the right reasons. Exactly. So this is a concept called Bitoch Shelo Lishma Ba Lishma, which we'll talk about later. Okay?
That's true with human interaction as well.
Of course, exactly. Somebody can start off helping somebody else because I figure this guy's a millionaire. If I get him out of the river, then he'll probably give me $1 million. And then afterwards, he feels good about it, and actually he realizes I don't want anything back from him. Right? I just want the mitzvah of having helped him. Sometimes from doing something not for ulterior motive. We're going to discuss that a little later. Now, why are we discussing this if it's not so practical? First of all, if there's nothing we can do about it. So it's number one is to give us an appreciation, right? The power that you should recognize the power and the return on investment of choosing to do something not just with a natural emotion, but to actually invest in the emotion. Does that make sense? Think about in a spousal relationship, right? We always appreciate when our spouse loves us, not just because like the Gemara does, whatever they tell us, certainly not when they're just paying lip service, right? Which we said is the staticity level, like this static level of just doing mitzvah without anything. We also appreciate when our spouses don't just say, I love you because you're my wife and that's it, but I love you because, and they even if they don't say anything to them, but they actually work on understanding and appreciating the other person and therefore loving them. Right? There's a much deeper appreciation there. Similarly with God, the soul ascends higher into God, let's say, right? The soul, just like by two people in a relationship, they actually become more interconnected. Similarly with God, we become more interconnected with God. In other words, when we say our soul climbs higher, we're fusing with the divine on a stronger level, the deeper we are invested in the mitzvah. Right? The mitzvah is an expression of our emotion for God, and sometimes we can do it without any emotion in it, so it's just lip service, right? Okay, it's worth something, but it's right. We said we spoke for 3 weeks about the power of action, but that wasn't it. And the next level is to infuse with Kavanah, and hopefully not just like a natural, I love you, God, that's why I put on tefillin, but actually investing and thinking of reasons and investing in that emotion of love for God. This is what the Zohar says, Tikkun Zohar says, that when a soul, that mitzvot, dechilu rechimu, that mitzvot fly above only if they have wings. And those wings are dechilu rechimu, which are the love and fear of God. In other words, when a mitzvah is driven by a love or a fear of God, one second. So a mitzvah.
That can't be true.
One second. A mitzvah driven by love and fear flies above. If not, then it remains down here. Irit. So this. The problem with that statement is that we spoke for 3 weeks about the power of doing something even if it's not inspired by anything.
Right.
Action is actually king. Action is actually way more powerful than Kavanah. But for now, for the purposes of today's conversation, we're emphasizing the contrast between something that's fueled by Kavanah or not fueled by Kavanah. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone with me so far?
It's the landing pad of the mitzvah.
No.
No.
I would say the opposite. These are the wings of the mitzvah. This is what helps the mitzvah fly above. It's what drives. It's the fuel for the mitzvah to allow the mitzvah to go up above.
Okay.
And not just to remain there. Does that make sense? In other words, the mitzvah connects us to God because that's what a mitzvah does. But the more intense our mitzvah is, the more emotion-fueled and the more emotion-fueled our mitzvot are, the deeper we connect with God.
Yeah, the command is the launching pad.
She said landing pad. Right. Anyways, so I guess even though this is not a practical conversation, right, but it certainly helps to inspire us to realize the power of when a mitzvah is driven, first of all, by emotion, and second of all, by emotion that was born through intellect. And even more importantly, when we do a mitzvah and it's not driven by emotion that's been powered by intellect, but just by emotion, just by natural emotion, we just do a mitzvah and it's driven by an emotion for God, at least we're no worse than the angels, right? Our soul goes up at least to Yetzirah, right? So at least that. Now, by the way, on Shabbat, all of the realms, this is, right, for those of you that were here by the one around the fire, which it looks like for tomorrow, we're going to have to cancel again because of the rain.
What's we cancel?
The musicians muse around the fire that we do around the fire, the class that we do around the fire when we sing. And Josh, officially tomorrow night. I have a feeling it was announced on Shabbos.
I wasn't here.
Oh, okay.
So how would
I did
know?
not send out an email because I saw the weather forecast.
What? Into it?
No, but they're in that booklet too.
Yeah, they're in the booklet. Yeah,
The
sure.
booklet that has everything.
The master booklet.
Yeah.
So that's canceled.
We call it the Bible, the PJA Bible. Anyways.
Looks like we are.
So for those of you that were here at the class that we had around the fire, which spoke about Shabbat, so one of the things we discussed then was the fact that the world lies silent, right? And as the candles are lit and Shabbat enters the world, a new energy enters the world, right? And as we discussed then, it's not just a figure of speech, but actually the world enters a different level, right? A more godly level, right? By the way, this is why, see, the more understanding you have of these concepts, the more words become interchangeable and you realize they're all the same concept. Many of you may have heard that Shabbat is a taste of Mashiach, right? The era of Mashiach is called the time when it will be fully Shabbat. Yeah. Why is that? Because on Shabbat, there is a higher level of godliness that comes into the world. There's a higher godly consciousness that comes into the world. When Mashiach comes, we're going to be in a constant state of godly revelation, right? There will be no death. Why? Because death is a result of the fact that there's not enough godly revelation in this world, etc. Okay, fine. But leaving that whole global conversation out of it.
Nobody lit Shabbos candles.
Oh, it's not necessarily by the Shabbos candles. No, the Talmud tells us that Shabbos mekad Shabakayma, Shabbos enters the world even if a person doesn't bring Shabbos in. Your question would apply even not just in the world if nobody lights Shabbat candles, but let's say a particular person. If a person doesn't light Shabbat candles, is it still Shabbat for them? And the answer is yes, because Shabbat doesn't only enter when we light Shabbat candles.
Right.
We usher in the Shabbat through our Shabbat candles. A conversation for a different time. Okay? Leah? For a different time. Okay. Now, so what is this? This is the point I want to discuss. What happens when Shabbos comes in to the world? Every one of these realms elevates. The level of Asiya elevates to the level of Yetzirah. The level of Yetzirah elevates to the level of Bria. The level of Bria elevates to the level of Yetzirah.
No matter what people do.
Correct.
Okay.
As a result, this gives us access that even a mitzvah that we do that's not necessarily fueled by as much emotion ascends to Bria. And therefore, even a simple Jew, like myself, can access the level of Bria just by having a plain emotion-fueled mitzvah. This is why the Hasidim would spend so much more time in prayer on Shabbat. This is why on Shabbat we try to do extra special things. We try to study more, etc., because we want to tap into this extra energy and actually attain spiritual highs that we wouldn't be able to during the week. In other words, if your peak spiritual high, the most you daven or the most you whatever, is on a Tuesday, you can only get so high. But if you have that same peak on a Shabbos, it gets you even higher. More bang for your buck. This is the reason why in America on Saturday nobody works. Because we are very busy serving God. It's the Lord's Day.
So if we don't do Havdalah and we extend Shabbat a little bit.
100%. This is why
time
Shulchan Aruch tells us that to attempt to extend Shabbat a little bit before Shabbat and a little bit after Shabbat. You got a time limit there, but yeah, this is why we have Melav Malka to accompany the queen out. This is why we do have Havdalah. This is why we smell Besamim, etc. Right? Because these are all interconnected, interrelated points. But here's the key. Here's the caveat. The caveat is this only applies to human beings. This doesn't apply to angels. Why? Because the ability to climb to this high realm only applies to human beings who can choose between good over evil. Therefore, they can make it to the world of Bria. An angel can never transcend Yetzirah because it's stuck in this realm because there's no freedom of choice. It's just doing what it does, like an animal does, fueled by emotion, but there's no intellect involved in it. Yeah, instinct is a good word, right? Exactly. There's no choice involved in that.
Like animals.
That sounds scary. I don't know why.
Now, all of this, because you're a human, that's why. You can join my movement. I have a movement for angels' rights.
Oh boy.
We have an angels' march. We have hats that say "Make angels great again." You know?
Yeah, tell me where that is. I won't be there.
We demonstrate, for the most part, we demonstrate in Yetzirah. We don't demonstrate.
Okay, I'll get that one day.
All right. Well, you got to bring it to the angels. Chassidus is always.
The angel protest?
What?
No.
Protest?
No, we protest. This is the thing. The angels cannot protest. We protest on behalf of the
But
angels.
they can change the
Because
situation.
only we can change the
They
angel
can
situation. But
Well, yeah, they rebelled once.
Mm.
No, they didn't.
Well,
That's a Christian concept.
yeah, that is. Yeah.
the class on Christianity is on Thursday nights. I think.
I'll probably miss that one. Been there, done that.
All right. So we're in section 3 now. For those that are following along in the handout. Now, all of this is what souls can do, because souls are limited. Right? Souls are created beings, created entities, etc. Therefore, there's only so far as they can go. However, our actions, the radiance, the light, the power, the energy that there is when we learn Torah or when we do a mitzvah, that actual mitzvah can actually transcend ourselves. Why is that? Because, as we say, schar mitzvah. The energy of the mitzvah itself can power it even further. What is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is the desire of God. And being as a mitzvah is the desire of God. It can fuse with God himself, but not the soul. How this helps us is a good question. how this affects us. It affects us because our souls, as we said, can never climb into the realm of Atzilut. We can never go so high as Atzilut. As Irit was so quick to say at the beginning of the class. Why is that? Because Atzilut, what?
Yeah.
Why is that? She's still in the go humans. I'm telling you, she's so, what's the word they call it when you have human privilege? That's what it is.
No,
Human privilege. You don't think of the angels and their poor predicament.
That's God's business.
So the reason for that is because Atzilut is actually not a physical realm, and because so much as we like to say our souls are spiritual.
Not really even physical.
I know, but so much as we like to say that our souls are not really physical, you're right, they're not really physical, but they are creations. They're spiritual, but they are creations. And the world of Atzilut cannot handle creations. The world of Atzilut precedes creation. The world of Atzilut is not even the potential for creation. Remember we said that?
Yeah.
The world of so were we to eventually make it to Atzilut, we would never.
It's pure spirit.
What?
Pure spirit.
If we would, we wouldn't exist. And if we, as part of, I think it was part of the Yutas Kislev story, the story when the Alter Rebbe was incarcerated and then eventually made it out of prison, etc. I can look up the details of the story and share with you next week. They had a psychologist come and do a psychoanalysis of the Alter Rebbe. And his conclusion, and this is written down, I believe the documents are public, like you can I don't know if public on the internet, but like they're accessible in libraries, etc., of the Alter Rebbe's interrogation, which has since been looked up. I mean, much of it has been lost, I think, because of certain political waves that happened in the region, in Russia, from Tsarist Russia to Communist Russia, etc., But I believe that this is publicly accessible. Certainly it's a story that's passed down, is that they did a psychoanalysis of the Alter Rebbe, and it came back very much not in favor of the Alter Rebbe. In other words, the Alter Rebbe was being accused at the time, to fill you in on the story, of being a counter-revolutionary, right? Now, there were multiple facets to that accusation that many people had put together against the Alter Rebbe. One of them was about the money that he was sending to Israel, to fellow Hasidim, and they said, you're supporting the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turks were at war with Tsarist Russia, etc. Okay, right? That's one of the more famous ones. Another one was that they said that in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe makes multiple references to the fact that Malchut, or kingship, and kings are really the lowest realm, etc., and therefore it's counter-revolutionary, he's against kings. So when they did the psychoanalysis, it came back, right? Because psychologists are not going to tell you exactly. They can't tell you exactly what the person wants. They can tell you where their emotions and where their leanings are. So the psychoanalysis of the Alter Rebbe read that he wants something that is impossible for him to attain. In other words, he wants the thing that he wants with all of his might and all of his being is way, way above him and is impossible for him to attain. This was translated by the Russian government as in he wants to overthrow the Tsar and wants to be the leader of Russia. Counter-revolutionary work with the whole narrative, and it did not work in favor of the Alter Rebbe, this particular psychoanalysis. And the Rebbe explained that what they didn't get about the Alter Rebbe is that this was actually referring to the Alter Rebbe's conduct throughout his life. His soul indeed yearned to rise to a level of Atzilut. But to rise to a level of Atzilut was in and of itself impossible, right?
He was
Contradiction.
A go-human
It was a contradiction of self. What?
He was a go-human too.
He was sure. If it helps. And by the way, this is told in many Hasidim that about the Alter Rebbe specifically. It's told that when he would daven, he would hold on to a bagel with butter, right? And they never heard this. Why? Because would he not hold on to a bagel with butter, his soul would leave its body. So that could be even to get to the level of Yetzirah or Bria, right? Because your soul has to leave your body and to completely be there. But then to get to the level of Atzilut would mean the soul would have to cease being soul. So the level of Atzilut is beyond the level of soul. But our actions, a mitzvah, which benefits from the mitzvah, from the light of the mitzvah itself, which is the light of the Almighty, right? Which is the actual desire of God Himself, can transcend it. We can send our little darts into Atzilut.
Cool.
Now, however, there is a way, and we're not going to elaborate on it today because it's not such a practical conversation. But since Irit wants to know about it, we'll do a little reading.
You read.
How the truly enlightened worship God. Okay, and in a nutshell, this is by using the power of our chachma. Right? So till now we've been talking about using the power of our intellect, which means our understanding, our da'at, etc. But using the power of chachma, right? Because essentially, in order to enter the level of Atzilut, what would one need to do? Transcend transcend the existence of oneself. Right? One would need to stop being oneself. A soul would need to stop being a soul, stop being a separate entity.
It would have to be no thing.
Exactly. In other words, the example always given in Chassidus is, it's like a match that's lit with a fire at the end of it, and that flame wants to become part of a bonfire. In order for the flame to become part of the bonfire, the flame cannot be a flame anymore. The existence of flame is going to stop existing. You're just going to be bonfire. Right? And the only way to do that is through our chachma, through our power of chachma. Pan, you want to read a little bit for us?
Where?
Page 461. And this, he says, is attainable by tzaddikim hagdolim. That's why for most souls, even tzaddik in the world of Atzilus cannot be their home, and consequently, Atzilus is the only repository of a few, especially great tzaddikim. Right? So normally, we're used to Tanya always telling us, oh, you Beinanim, you can't do that, but tzaddikim can do it. Here he says, even among the tzaddikim, only the great tzaddikim can do it. Start from the implication on page 461.
The implication here is that the great tzaddikim do not worship through Bina and Das, but rather
cognition and recognition, which are the best translations for Bina and Dat, but rather
they worship God through the highest intellectual power of Chokhmah, or inquiry. In fact, just as we learned, the 6 emotional sephiros have their nest in Yetzirah, and the supernatural mother, Bina.
The supernal mother, yeah, go ahead. Bina has her nest in the throne, Bria.
In the throne, Bria. We are also taught that the supernal father, Chokhmah, rests in Atzilus. Rabbi Shalom.
In the Mikdash Melech, which is a commentary on the Zohar. Go ahead. So Atzilus
is not unreachable by the mind.
Comes with sound effects.
That was very exciting.
I didn't see that.
It's not unreachable by the mind. It's just beyond the grasp of our cognitive apparatus and can only be appreciated with Chokhmah. Why is this the case? Above, we explained that the rational intellect, Bina and Das, can bring you to Beriah because the intellect is objective and gets you out of yourself. This is deep. Emotions, we learned, are personal and biased, whereas the intellect can be transpersonal and objective.
Right? So, just to recap, we spoke about it in different words. That's it. To Yetzirah we get by what? By mitzvot, by doing mitzvot that are fueled simply by emotion. Like animals. Yetzirah, we said, is right. That's where the angels hang out. And the angels are always called chayot and behemot, words that are usually referenced for animals. Why? Because it's purely emotional. In order for us to transcend to Bria, we need to use our cognition. We need to use the intellect, the ability to say, right? Remember the spousal relationship example analogy? We need to use our cognition, which tells us, I am going to think about something outside of me, which I can't feel about something outside of me, unless I use my intellect that fuels my emotions to say I want to feel for somebody else, in this case for God. Right? Mm-hmm. That's how we get to Bria. But that cannot get us beyond Bria. It allows us to get past ourselves, but it has to originate from within ourselves. That is true. Here he's going to explain what I just said. Go ahead.
That is true to an extent. They always give and then take away.
Yeah, exactly.
It's true that the subject which you are studying is transpersonal. It's something beyond and external to you.
I love God, right? And I've managed to do that. I don't just love God because of me. It's not inspired by me. I don't love God because I am God, but I love God because it's something outside of me, right? Not that that's true, but I've managed to get past my own ego to love something that's beyond me, right? But the tools of intellectual processing with which you grasp the subject are very much personal, right? You're using your own intellect, your own emotions. Those tools determine how you digest an idea which has come your way. So it turns out that the experience of Bria, rational intellect, is a partial transcendence of self and not a full one. You manage to get beyond yourself, but only inspired by you. So I guess think of a ship that's anchored. So you can go places, but you're still always anchored to where the anchor is left. The external subject material gets you out of yourself, but the tools of analysis draw you back into your ego. Here, finish off for us at page 462. So how do we completely transcend ourselves?
Normally, your Chachma and Bina work together in your mind, doing opposite jobs. Chachma collects information from the outside, Bina processes it on the inside. To do that, Chachma needs to be in a state of wonderment, openness, and humility.
By accepting ideas from the outside, we do not necessarily mean from someone else sitting in the room with me, or from something inspired by something I see, etc. You can
like observation.
No, not observation either. So the best example given in Chassidus is true Chachma operates best when you sit in a room, close your eyes, turn off your anything else, power of feeling or senses, or turn off your senses. Now, obviously you can't turn them off, right? But get out of tune with them as much as possible. Clear your mind of all other ideas, and then an idea enters. Meditation usually implies that usually meditations work with a mantra or something along those lines. In other words, you're more directed, and more important than directed, you're anchored to a particular thought. You're thinking deeper about a particular thought that you might know about. Chachma, and that's Bina and Dat. Chachma says, get out of yourself. Open yourself up to accept an idea from somewhere else. Where is that somewhere else? Deeply discussed in Chassidus. Not for now. Something called a koach hamaskil, which transcends us and is beyond us, etc. But allow and from the world of ideas. It's not in this physical world. And chachma means open yourself up to that kind of concept. True creativity is that. True creativity in this world is rare, and that's what true creativity is. Strokes of brilliance in that way come from outside of you. Outside, they don't come from observation, etc. So.
Einstein.
Chassidus, beyond Einstein, music.
Yeah.
Great thing. So Chassidus would actually I believe, and I don't know that I'm knowledgeable enough to take, to actually back the statement that I'm about to say, but I would imagine Chassidus would take issue with the common idiom thrown around today's day and age. That creation is essentially just a merging of multiple ideas. That is a form of making something, but it's not creation. It's not creativity. It's not creativity. Creativity is not taking multiple ideas. I read a long book. I can't remember right now what it's called, but essentially, I've got the name, the title of the book. I read it many years ago. But they were claiming that creativity is almost a process, and they were trying to work creativity down to a process. And the process is either they even made it mathematical to a certain degree. It's either addition or subtraction, etc. I'll never forget one of the cool ideas I saw there was how they were saying that one of the brilliant ideas is when you either addition, subtraction, division, and they were saying that the concept of taking a fridge. Somebody came up with this idea, this invention, that you don't have a fridge in your kitchen. Instead, you have a drawer which is refrigerated. Has anybody ever heard of this? This is some of the modern kitchens have this. They don't have an actual fridge. We're used to all the items that we want to keep cold are in one place, right? But that you have a drawer which is cold and a closet which is cold, and you have maybe you have multiple different in your kitchen. Multiple areas are cold or hot. And he's saying that was just division, dividing up, taking the existing idea which is a fridge and then dividing it. But true creativity, I think Chassidus would argue, is way beyond something that's calculable and has to come from somewhere beyond you. Anyways, Chachma. So Chachma is all about openness and wonderment, getting rid of yourself. It needs to be detached from yourself. Go ahead. If you were constantly...
Get out of the way.
Needs
Exactly.
to be detached from yourself. If you were constantly preoccupied with what ideas and events meant to you, you'd be a bad listener. You would never hear what another person is really saying, because 100% of your attention would be on noting your own reaction. So for Chachma to do its job and to receive wisdom from the outside, it must be totally detached from self and focused entirely on the other. Chachma then feeds the tools of Bina and Das, which process the raw information, analyzing it precisely to work out what idea means to
What the idea means to you. Okay, this is the normal process of Chachma, Bina, Dat, and then from Dat, as we've learned extensively at the beginning of Tanya, it then translates and transmits into emotion. Right? From Dat, it moves on to emotion. Dat, in fact, in Chassidus is commonly referred to as the neck, because there's the mind and then there's the heart, right? And connected from the intellect to the emotions, right? It passes through this passageway, which we call the neck, and that's referring to Dat. Okay? But how do we connect to God in a way that there's no Bina and Dat involved at all? Right? How do we fuel our mitzvot only with Chachma? But imagine.
Oh, I'm thinking here. But imagine what would happen if you could get stuck, so to speak, in Chachma. Yes, never progressing to the question, what does this mean to me? You'd be in a state of amazement and wonder at the universe. You'd lose your rigid sense of self and see your role as a force put here for greater cause.
There's no me, there's just the world, and there's just God. So I'm just part of that. I'm not a receiver. I guess I'm a receiver, but I'm nothing. Go ahead.
Most of your fears would drop away because loss and misfortune are all bound up with your fragmented self-concept. Your thought about God wouldn't be, what can God do for me, but rather, I'm nothing but the power of God within me. Amen. While you can't really know what Asilas is like until you get there, we can get there?
Well, we're talking about this, that the great and few tzaddikim were able to.
The Tanya gives us one simple guidepost here. It's about transcending Bina and Das and reaching the consciousness of Chachma.
Okay, and that's it. More than that, we don't know. This is what Tanya gives us about it. So, we know that it's possible to reach Atzilus. Our soul can get there. It has to transcend itself. It's only available to great and few tzaddikim, and not something you should try at home. And it would involve being in a constant state of Chachma. Just to clarify here, most of us here in this world have very few encounters with the state of Chachma, even on a regular level, even on a level of Chachma that will connect to Bina and Dat. Here we're talking about being in an active sense or state, or you manage to get yourself a preoccupied sense of Chachma and a stuck in Chachma, so to speak. What's the result of Chachma? By the way, Chachma, Chassidus always references the fact that the etymological root of Chachma is, the letters of Chachma rearranged are Koach Ma, which means it's a power that when you see it, you ask, what is it? In other words, it's the ultimate state of submission to God. Right? So we're in number 4, the second to last bullet point. You'll see transcension, true transcension of self is only via Chachma, which is complete submission to the Almighty. And this level of service is usually unattainable for regular souls, with the exception of special moments such as during the Amida, etc. Why? Because what we're talking about here is a moment where you completely get out of the way, right? He references right away. All of you should have been able to tell me this. As soon as the Alter Rebbe ever begins talking about a level where you're completely out of the way and there's complete transcension, complete submission to God, right away he references Ha'avot. Our forefathers were known for being chariots, right? The word chariot, why? Because just like a chariot has no desire of which direction it wants to go, only the rider has the direction which it wants to go. Similarly, our forefathers, they were just expressions of God, of what God wanted in this world. If we can ever reach such a state, even for a brief moment, we will have reached the stage of Chachma, and perhaps our souls will be able to enter the level of Atzilut, the realm of Atzilut. If attainable at all, so I said before, don't try this at home. Okay, I'll take that back. Try it at home. If attainable at all, it will have to be in a special moment. Yom Kippur, Shmona Esrei, Amida, etc. A moment where we're in complete unity with the divine and the most ideal one of those. In other words, the Amida as it was meant to be and in the most ideal form of the Amida. Yom Kippur as it was meant to be but in the most ideal form of Yom Kippur. Does that make sense? That if it would happen, that's when it would happen. Okay. And now the Alter Rebbe comes back to that Mishnah which says in Pirkei Avot, Schar mitzvah mitzvah, that the reward for a mitzvah is this mitzvah, right? And here he has another interesting play on the words. He says, you want to know what the power of a mitzvah is? He says, look at Schar mitzvah, look at the reward of mitzvah. In other words, look at the destination. If you want to know how powerful a mitzvah is, look at where it went to. This is what he introduces, and we did things a lot of order. We spoke about this before, but let me just summarize the concept. This is where he introduces the fact that the Tikkun Zohar says that without a proper fear or love of heaven, mitzvah cannot fly above. I'll never forget, I once heard a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov. Not famous, whatever, a story about the Baal Shem Tov, that he once entered a synagogue, and it was a synagogue of non-Hasidim. And he said, this room is full of prayers. There's so much prayer in this room, it's unbelievable. It's so powerful. And then he entered a room which was a synagogue of Hasidim, and he said, this room is empty of prayers. There's no prayers here. And Hasidim said, I don't understand. I thought you want us to be Hasidim. You want us to study Hasidus before davening. He said, yes. The room which had people who didn't learn Hasidus, that's where their prayers stayed. Their prayers, they would pray, and there would be words, and the words were floating around the room, and they didn't know where to go. He says, but in a room where all the people that were davening had learned Chassidus before, in other words, they had meditated and fueled the proper emotion and actually davened to Hashem with a love, with a fear of God, right? With emotions that fueled their davenings, then the davening left the room and it went up above, transcending spiritual levels, right? So, if a mitzvah is not motivated by emotion, it cannot really be for the sake of Hashem. Remember we said those 4 levels? The lowest level is for an ulterior motive. That's what we're going to discuss in section 6. But in section 5, we're talking about that level of staticity where like you're just doing mitzvah, you're just doing it. You're just davening, you're just studying Torah, but there's no actual, you have no emotion for the bad, no emotion for the good. It's just, you're just doing it. And just doing it is not going to get it anywhere. A mitzvah cannot fly above without actually being powered by kavanah, by some sort of emotion. And then finally there's the level of an ulterior motive. Right? What happens when a person studies Torah, let's say, for right, to become an intellect, like we spoke about, right? Or does a mitzvah, he gives tzedakah like that, I don't know, like that his business looks better, or like that he looks like a better person, or like to give himself more power or whatever, because he wants more power over people, so he becomes this philanthropist and then he has a lot of power over people, or whatever it is. Right? He gives tzedakah to a school like that, he can have power over the direction that the school will take, and whatever it is. When a person does that, says the Alter Rebbe, then not just the mitzvah is static and not flying above, but the opposite is true, right? As you can imagine, it's being powered by a force, it's being powered by an emotion, but that emotion is driven by klipa. Then you take that Torah learning and you take that mitzvah, which you did, it is a mitzvah. We said the power is action, right? So, to a certain degree, you could say that person is better than somebody who doesn't do a mitzvah at all. But that mitzvah is in exile among the forces of klipa. And until the person does teshuvah, let's say, for instance, he starts realizing, right? We said, he saves a millionaire and all he wants is the reward. But with time, if he can actually learn to appreciate that, if he can actually learn to do a mitzvah for the proper reasons, and actually learn to do a mitzvah, and actually do a mitzvah, fueled by an emotion for God, then that's called doing teshuvah, and going back on that negative way, that wrong direction, and then not just does he redeem himself, not just does he do teshuvah, but he can actually uplift that Torah learning or that mitzvah with him. So it's not completely useless. However, I think if there's one lesson that we can take from today's chapter, it's to recognize the power of when we do a mitzvah and it is fueled by emotion. And that emotion hopefully can be active emotion. Something that we actually, before we do a mitzvah, we stop. We say, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? I'm trying to connect with the Almighty. I'm davening, I'm learning, whatever it is. I pause before I do that to say, I'm going to connect with God and to think about God. And maybe to take half an hour and just meditate. To do that. On Shabbos, then you double your luck. But when we do a mitzvah powered by an emotion, then the mitzvah can take us way higher than we can ever imagine. With this we conclude Jewish Mysticism Lessons in Tanya, chapter 39, the power of Kavanah, indeed, the very, very strong power of Kavanah, part 2.